The sun rose slowly over the endless stretch of golden plains, painting the wide sky in strokes of pink and orange. In the far distance, beyond the rolling hills and clusters of cottonwood trees, stood a modest ranch, weatherwood, a small corral, and a lone figure moving with steady purpose. The ranch lay far from any town or road. The nearest neighbor was a good hour's ride away. It was a place where silence ruled, disturbed only by the sound of wind brushing against the prairie grass and the occasional call of a hawk high above. Ethan Cole had built his days around that silence. He woke with the dawn, always at the same time, with the same slow, careful motions. Years of living alone had made his routines precise. First came the kettle on the stove, a cup of black coffee sipped while the sky changed colors outside his window. Then the boots, scuffed leather that had seen 1,000 miles, and finally the hat, set on his head like a shield between him and the world. By the time the first light fully touched the earth, he was already outside with his cattle. The herd was small, just enough to keep him busy. They were his livelihood, and in some ways his company. He moved among them with ease, checking their health, repairing fences when needed, scattering hay in measured hands. The work was tiring, but there was a certain comfort in its rhythm. No shouting, no deals to make, no one to answer to, only the steady sound of hooves in the dirt and the whisper of the prairie winds. By midday, he would return to the house, the heat of the sun warming his back as he crossed the yard. The house itself was plain, one room with a small kitchen in the corner, a wooden table, a narrow bed, and a worn rocking chair near the hearth. It was not much, but it was enough for him. Lunch was simple: bread, dried meat, maybe a stew left simmering from the night before. Afterward, he spent his time fixing tools, mending tack, or sharpening his knife. Some days he rode out farther into the open plains, scouting the land for signs of predators, always careful, always aware of the silence around him. In the evenings, when the skies softened into a blanket of purple and gold, Ethan would sit by the fire, the book in his hand, often unread, as his thoughts drifted elsewhere. The crackle of the flames became a steady companion, their glow casting long shadows across the room. The quiet of those nights was heavy, but he had grown used to it. It was a kind of quiet that, at one time, might have felt like a burden, but now it had become a shield. It was safer this way. With no one around, there was no one left to lose. Though he seldom allowed himself to dwell on it, the walls of the cabin held memories of a different life. There had been a time when this place was filled with voices and laughter. That was years ago, before loss came like a wildfire and took it all away. Friends had urged him to leave, to sell the ranch and move closer to town. But he stayed, as though rooted to the soil by the very ghost he wanted to escape. Now, he kept the past behind a locked door in his mind, opening it only rarely when a certain smell or a sound in the wind forced him to remember. No one visited the ranch anymore. Those who passed through the area had learned that Ethan preferred to be left alone. He was not rude when approached, but he was not inviting either. At the general store, when he went into town once a month for supplies, he spoke little, kept himself, and returned as quickly as he could. It wasn't that he hated people. It was just that he had forgotten how to live among them. Out here, there was no judgment, no pity, and no risk of caring too deeply for anyone ever again. Yet, there were moments when the emptiness pressed too hard on him. As he sat outside in the cool dusk, the world quiet and endless, he sometimes felt the ache of solitude gnawing at his heart. Watching the sun slip away beyond the plains, he wondered, briefly, what life might have been like if things had turned out differently. But such thoughts were dangerous. They opened doors he had closed long ago. So he shook them off and returned to the life he knew, one of work, silence, and the simple, predictable safety of being alone. On that particular evening, as the prairie wind carried the scent of rain and the cattle grazed quietly beyond the fence, Ethan stood on the porch and let the vastness of the land calm him. His eyes swept across the horizon where the grasses swayed like waves, and the skies seemed to stretch forever. He took a slow, deep breath. This was his life. Steady, solitary, unchanging. And for all the wounds of the past, he told himself that it was enough. Little did he know, the stillness he had worked so hard to protect was about to be interrupted. Beyond those wide-open fields, far away but drawing closer with every step, Two lives were on a collision course with his own, a meeting that would soon test everything he thought he knew about peace, solitude, and the meaning of home. The next morning came as it always did, with the pale light spilling across the plains. Ethan woke early, brewed his coffee, and stepped outside to start the day. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint smell of wet earth from a light rain during the night. The land looked washed clean, as if it had been polished by nature. He liked mornings like these. They had a kind of honesty to them. But as he stood there sipping the bitter coffee, a memory crept into his thoughts, uninvited, like a shadow slipping under a closed door. He had been 25 when everything changed. Back then, this ranch had been filled with promise. There had been laughter here, real laughter, the kind that warmed the walls and made a house feel alive. His parents had worked beside him, and for a time there was even a young woman who wore his ring and dreamed of building a future with him. Those days had been long and hard, but full of purpose. Every nail he hammered into the wood of the house, every fence post he set into ground, had been for them, for the life they planned to share. But fate had other plans. The fever came first, sweeping through the nearby town like wildfire. It stole his parents quickly, one after another, leaving him stunned and hollow. And then, before he could even begin to recover from that blow, there had been the accident on the road that took the woman he loved. A runaway wagon, a moment too slow to step aside, and just like that she was gone. No time for goodbyes, no last words. One moment he had everything, and in the next there was nothing but an empty house and silence that pressed on him like a weight. For a while after that, he had tried to hold on. Friends came by to help, to talk, to sit with him during the long nights. But grief has a way of making every sound feel like an intrusion, every kind gesture like a painful reminder. After a year, the visits grew less frequent, and then they stopped altogether. By then, Ethan had already made his decision. He wouldn't go back to town except for what he needed. He wouldn't open himself to that kind of hurt again. Solitude, as cruel as it was, at least kept him safe from losing someone else. That decision shaped the years that followed. Each season passed like a page in a book with no surprises. He planted, he harvested, he repaired fences, he rode out to check on cattle, came home, ate alone, and went to sleep. His life became a rhythm of work and rest, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. It was peaceful, yes, but peace often felt a lot like emptiness. When the nights were long, when the wind howled through the cracks of the old house, that emptiness sometimes seemed unbearable. On those nights, he would lie awake staring at the ceiling, the images of those he had lost flickering behind his eyes. He could still see his mother's gentle smile, hear his father's deep voice calling him from the corral, feel the way his fiancée's hand fit perfectly in his. These memories came with a sweetness that cut as sharp as any blade, and though he tried not to let them overwhelm him, sometimes he wondered if his choice to be alone was really protection, or if it was just another form of surrender. The morning passed, and by midday the wind began to pick up, carrying with it a smell that warned of rain to come. The clouds gathered slowly over the horizon, thick and heavy. He had work to finish before the weather turned. There were tools to be put away, animals to check on, and a few loose boards on the barn that needed to be nailed down. Ethan moved with practiced speed, his body knowing what needed to be done without him having to think too hard. That was how he liked it. Work kept his mind quiet. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened. The land that had looked so wide and open now felt smaller, the air heavy and tense. A storm was coming, and with it came a restless energy that set the horses shifting uneasily in their stalls. He pulled the barn doors shut, making sure everything was secure. Then, as the first drops of rain began to fall, he crossed the yard to the house. Thunder rolled low in the distance, a sound that seemed to vibrate through his chest. Inside, he lit a lamp and settled into the chair by the window, watching as the rain fell harder. The storm hit quickly after that, sheets of water hammering against the roof, wind howling around the corners of the cabin. It was the kind of storm that made the world outside disappear. Alone in that house, he should have felt safe, but tonight there was something different in the air, something unsettled. It was as if a storm was trying to tell him that the quiet life he had built for himself was about to change. Ethan sat there for a long time, the glow of the lamp casting a circle of light around him. He let the storm rage outside, his thoughts drifting back and forth between the past and the present. He had no way of knowing that somewhere out there, walking through this very storm, were two sisters searching for shelter. He had no idea that before the rain cleared, their paths would meet, and the life he had guarded so fiercely would never be the same again. For now, there was only the sound of thunder, the hiss of rain against the glass, and the steady beat of a man's heart that had long since given up on the idea of change. But fate, as it had so many years ago, was already on its way. The storm reached its peak as night fell. Lightning split the sky in sharp, jagged streaks, and thunder roared close behind it. Rain poured in heavy sheets, drumming against the cabin roof and soaking the earth outside until it turned to mud. Ethan sat by the window, the glow of a single oil lamp at his side, watching the world vanish behind a curtain of water. Nights like this rarely brought anything new. On a ranch as isolated as his, storms usually meant only one thing, waiting them out alone. But tonight, there was something different. Beneath the howl of the wind, a faint sound reached his ears, a dull, rhythmic thudding that didn't belong to the storm. He frowned, set aside his book, and listened. At first, he thought it was his imagination. Then it came again, a pounding, steady and deliberate against the wooden door. A knock. He hesitated for a moment, unsure he'd heard correctly. But there was again, louder this time. Whoever it was had come a long way to be out here in weather like this. Pushing himself up in the chair, he crossed the room and unlatched the door. When he pulled open, the wind nearly tore out his hands, and the rain swept inside in a cold gust. Standing on the porch, half hidden in the storm, were two girls. They looked no older than 17 or 18 for the elder, and perhaps 12 or 13 for the younger. Both were soaked to the skin, their long, dark hair plastered to their faces, their clothes torn and clinging to them. Mud streaked their boots and hems, and their arms trembled from exhaustion. Yet, even through the rain and exhaustion, there was a dignity in the way they stood, straight back despite their fear. For a moment, none of them spoke. The elder girl's lips parted, but no words came out at first. She swallowed hard, then tried again. "Please," she said, her voice barely rising above the wind. "Can we have water? And a place to rest? Just for tonight?" Ethan looked from one girl to the other, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly. In all his years on this ranch, he had never opened his door to strangers in the middle of a storm. But something in her faces, desperation, yes, but also an unbroken pride, kept him from shutting the door. "You're half drowned," he said gruffly, stepping aside. "Get in before you freeze." The younger sister cast a quick, wary glance at her older sibling, who gave a slight nod before stepping through the doorway. The younger followed silently, dripping water onto the wooden floor as they crossed into the safety of the cabin. Ethan closed the door behind them, shutting out the wind and the rain. The sudden stillness inside felt heavy. He took a moment to study them in the warm glow of the lamp. The elder girl's dress was torn at the hem and sleeves, patched in places but still neat where it could be. She carried herself with composure that told him she had been forced to grow up too soon. The younger, barefoot and shivering, clung to her sister's arm like a lifeline, wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar room. Ethan fetched a blanket from the chest and handed it to them. "Here," he said, "wrap yourselves up. You can sit by the fire." They murmured their thanks, voices soft and cautious. As the girls huddled near the fireplace, trying to soak up its warmth, Ethan moved around the small kitchen, pulling out a pan, some bread, and a pot of stew left from earlier. The smell of it filled the room, and he noticed the way the younger sister's eyes followed the food as if she hadn't eaten in days. "What's your name?" he asked finally, breaking the silence as he set bowls on the table. The elder answered, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm Ayana. This is my sister, Nita." "Where'd you come from?" he asked. Ayana hesitated. "Far," she said at last. "We've been walking a long way. We don't mean to trouble you. Just one night. We'll be gone by morning." Ethan nodded slightly. "Eat first," he said simply. "Then we'll talk." They didn't argue. The two sisters sat at the table, their hands cupped around the warm bowls, as if afraid the food might be taken away. Nita, the younger, ate quickly at first, hunger overriding her manners, but Ayanna slowed her, placing a calming hand on her arm. They ate in silence, except for the occasional crackle of the fire and the sound of the storm outside. As they finished, Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You can stay tonight," he said. "The barn's warm enough, or you can sleep here by the fire. But tomorrow, you tell me what you're running from." Ayanna's gaze met his, dark eyes unreadable. For a moment, she seemed to weigh her words, but in the end she only nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. The rest of the night passed quietly. Nita curled up under the blanket on a rug near the fire, asleep almost as soon as her head rested on the folded fabric. Ayanna sat awake longer, staring into the flames, her expression tight, as though the fire itself might burn away the fear clinging to her. Ethan, sitting in his chair, said nothing. He could see they carried secrets heavy enough to bend their shoulders, but tonight, at least, he let them rest. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin there was a fragile calm. For the first time in years, the old ranch house was no longer empty, and though Ethan told himself it was only for one night, deep down, a quiet unease stirred in him, a sense that this meeting had changed something, though he couldn't yet name what. The storm outside grew heavier as the night stretched on. Rain lashed against the windows with unrelenting force, and each rumble of thunder seemed to shake the old wooden walls of the cabin. Inside, the faint glow of the fire painted everything in shades of gold and shadow. Ethan sat in his chair, arms resting on his knees, staring quietly at the two sisters. It had been years since anyone other than himself had been inside this cabin, and now there they were, two strangers who had stumbled into his life out of nowhere. He studied their faces as they sat huddled together under the blanket he had given them. Their eyes were still wary, even as the heat from the fire brought a little color back to their cheeks. They were exhausted, no doubt about that, but there was something in their posture, something proud, that kept them from collapsing entirely. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, wrestling with himself. He had told them they could stay the night, but even now, he wasn't sure if it was the right choice. For years, he had made a rule: no one stays, no one gets close. The walls he built around his life weren't just made of wood and nails. They were built from pain, from loss, from the simple truth that caring about people meant one day losing them. But as he watched the way the younger girl clung to her sister's arm, her small body trembling with fatigue, he knew he couldn't turn them away. Even if their presence made him uncomfortable, he wouldn't send them back out into the storm. "Soup's still warm," he muttered finally, pushing himself up and walking toward the stove. He ladled the thick stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table. "Eat while you can. You both look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." The elder girl, Ayanna, she had said her name was, helped her sister stand. They moved slowly, their wet clothes sticking to their skin, one seated. The younger one glanced at Ethan with a mixture of hesitation and hunger, as though unsure the food was really meant for them. "Go on," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's there to be eaten." The first spoonful seemed to melt into them. Nita, the younger, tried to eat carefully, but the urgency of her hunger kept her from slowing down. Ayanna nudged her gently, whispering something in a low voice, and the younger girl nodded, forcing herself to take smaller bites. Ethan pretended not to notice. When they were done, he poured them warm water into tin cups and placed a loaf of bread between them. He didn't ask them questions yet. They were too tired to answer anything meaningful, and he figured trust wasn't built in an evening. Finally, as they sat back on the table, their faces less pale now, he asked a question that had been pressing on his mind. "You said you've been walking a long way. Where are you heading?" There was a long pause. Ayanna's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. She glanced at Nita, then back at him. "Somewhere safe," she said softly. "Safe from what?" His voice was calm, not accusing, but insistent. Her lips pressed together. "I'll tell you tomorrow," she said after a moment, "if that's all right. Tonight we just need to rest." Ethan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Tomorrow, then." He grabbed a second blanket from the chest and spread it out on the rug in front of the fire. "You'll sleep here. It's warm enough. Better than the barn. Nita's small voice finally spoke up, the first word she had said all evening. "Thank you," she whispered. The simple sincerity of it caught him off guard. He had almost forgotten what it sounded like to have gratitude in his home. "Get some rest," he said quietly, turning back to the chair. As the hours passed, the storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin a strange calm settled over three of them. Nita was asleep within minutes, her small form curled beneath the blanket. Ayanna stayed awake longer, her eyes flickering between the fire and the man who had given them shelter. At one point, she spoke softly, so soft he almost didn't hear it over the crackle of the fire. "We'll be gone by morning," she said. Ethan didn't look up from the flames. "You'll stay the night," he replied. "That's all that matters right now." After that, there were no more words. The hours dragged slowly toward midnight, and one by one, the cabin's occupants surrendered to sleep. The storm beat on, wind howling, rain hammering against the wooden walls. But for the first time in what must have been days, the sisters slept without fear. Their breathing became slow and steady, their bodies finally giving in to exhaustion. Ethan sat awake a while longer, watching them with a complicated expression. Something about their presence unsettled him, not in a way that made him feel unsafe, but in a way that made him feel. They were a reminder of everything he had locked away. Compassion, connection, the fragile ties that could bind people together, even in a world that had taught him how dangerous that could be. As the fire died down to embers, he pulled a blanket over himself in the chair, letting sleep take him at last. Outside, the storm began to weaken, the thunder rolling farther and farther away. By morning, the land would be washed clean, and for the first time in years, there would be two new faces at the ranch to greet the dawn. What none of them knew was that this night, this one act of opening his door, was the beginning of something none of them had expected, a new chapter for all three lives. Morning broke calm and clear after the long night of rain. The sky stretched wide and blue, washed clean of the storm's fury. Puddles dotted the ground around the ranch, and the earth smelled of fresh mud and grass. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his hat pulled low to block the bright sun. Behind him, the sound of soft footsteps came from inside, the sisters stirring, hesitant to step into the day. They emerged slowly, both still looking worn, but cleaner after a night of warmth and food. Ayanna had managed to brush her wet hair into some order, and Nita clutched the blanket around her like a shield. The light of the morning revealed details he hadn't noticed the night before. Their clothes, patched and faded, had clearly been worn for many miles. Even in daylight, their posture remained proud, as though they refused to be defined by hardship. "I need to head into town," Ethan said, tying the cinch strap on his horse. "I'll get extra supplies. You two stay here and rest. Don't open the door for anyone." Ayanna nodded, though there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "We will," she said softly. The ride to town was long, and the ground, still soft from the storm, made it slower than usual. As Ethan approached, he saw a few people already outside, men leaning on fence rails, women sweeping the porches of their stores. It didn't take long for word to spread when something unusual happened in a small community like this, and his ranch, empty for years, now had visitors. He went straight to the general store, nodding to the people he passed. Most nodded back, but there was something curious, almost probing in their eyes. He tied his horse outside, pushed open the door, and stepped into the familiar smell of flour, dried tobacco, and wooden shelves. "Morning," Mr. Grady, the store owner, said from behind the counter. But there was a look on his face that wasn't just casual greeting. "Heard you had company last night." Ethan picked up a sack of flour, setting it on the counter with a firm thud. Storm blew in some travelers, gave them a roof until the rain passed. Grady raised an eyebrow. "Travelers?" "Folks said they saw two young native girls walking your way yesterday afternoon, right before the storm hit." Ethan didn't answer right away, focusing instead on gathering a few more items: coffee, beans, salt. The room was quiet except for the scrape of packages being set down. When he finally met Grady's eyes, his voice was calm. "That's right. You know how people talk," Grady said, lowering his voice slightly. "Some folks are already wondering why two girls like that are at your place." You live alone, Ethan. People notice things. I didn't bring them in for folks to notice, Ethan said evenly. I brought them in so they wouldn't freeze to death. A woman from the back of the store, who had been picking through fabric, looked over. That might be true, Ethan, she said, but folks are saying you'll regret getting mixed up with them. Strangers bring trouble. Maybe, Ethan replied, his tone firm but not raised. But I'll take trouble over turning away 2 kids in the middle of a storm. There was a silence after that. People in the store exchanged glances, but no one said anything more as he continued to collect his supplies. They knew Ethan as a quiet man, but they also knew he wasn't someone to be pushed once he'd made up his mind. By the time he left the store, the murmurs had already started outside. He heard pieces of sentences. 2 girls at his ranch, native girls, alone out there with him. But he ignored them. Gossip was as much a part of small towns as dust on the road. None of them had been there last night. None of them had seen the fear in those girls' eyes. Back at the ranch, the sisters were waiting. They stood in the doorway as he rode in, their faces anxious. When he dismounted, Nita was the first to speak. Did people see us? They did, Ethan said. He untied the sacks and carried them inside. And they'll talk. That's what folks do. But it doesn't matter. You're staying here until you decide what you want to do next. Ayanna followed him into the kitchen. We don't want to make trouble for you, she said quietly. You didn't, he replied, setting the supplies on the table. I make my own choices. Let people say what they want. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, but there was still a heaviness in her eyes. Thank you, she said. Not everyone would do that. That afternoon, he taught Nita how to brush down the horses. She laughed for the first time since she arrived, her small hands careful on the animals' coats. Ayanna helped with some of the simpler chores, and though her steps were hesitant, she worked hard, clearly unaccustomed to standing still. The rest of the day passed quietly, but Ethan couldn't ignore the feeling that the calm was fragile. He had seen it before, how quickly kindness could turn into judgment when the wrong words spread through a town. The choice he had made would not be easily understood by his neighbors. And yet, as he stood on the porch that evening, watching the sisters talk softly to each other inside, he knew he had no intention of sending them away. The days that followed were quieter than Ethan had expected. The gossip from town stayed far away, fading into the distance like the echo of the storm that had already passed. On the ranch itself, the rhythm of work returned, but there was something different now. A second set of footsteps in the yard, softer voices in the evenings, and the quiet hum of life where once there had been only silence. At first, the sisters kept to themselves. Ayanna moved carefully, as if afraid to overstep, and Nita never strayed far from her side. They watched Ethan closely, but spoke little. He didn't press them. Instead, he showed them the work that needed to be done, step by step, as though life on the ranch could teach them its own language. One morning, he brought them out to the stables. The horses, restless from the recent storm, snorted and stamped their hooves. Ethan placed a brush in Nita's small hands and guided her fingers. Slow, he said gently. They like it steady. Talk to them as you work. It keeps them calm. At first, she hesitated, barely touching the brush to the horse's coat. But as the minutes passed, she grew bolder. The mare lowered its head, enjoying the gentle strokes, and Nita's shoulders eased for the first time since she'd arrived. A shy smile tugged at her lips, and then, unexpectedly, she let out a small laugh when the horse nudged her with its nose. It was a sound Ethan hadn't realized he'd missed in his house. A clear, innocent sound that pushed back years of silence. See, he said, his voice softer than usual. Doesn't take much for them to like you. By the end of the week, caring for the horses became part of Nita's morning routine. She would run to the stables before breakfast, her bare feet kicking up the dust, eager to start brushing. The animals, once wary of strangers, began to recognize her, nudging her hand as soon as she entered. While Nita bonded with the horses, Ayanna found her own place helping with chores. She followed Ethan as he worked, learning how to mend broken fence rails and carry water from the well. At first, her movements were cautious, unsure, but she worked with quiet determination. When he showed her how to tie knots for repairing a broken gate, she practiced until her fingers got it right. When a patch of the barn roof needed mending, she climbed the ladder without hesitation, holding the nails steady while he hammered. Cooking became another place where trust slowly formed. The small kitchen, once a lonely place, now filled with the sound of soft voices and clinking pots. Ayanna was careful, almost hesitant at first, unsure whether she was intruding on something personal. But Ethan welcomed her help, handing her vegetables to chop, showing her where supplies were kept, and even teaching her one of his mother's simple bread recipes. The first loaf they baked together came out uneven and a little too brown, but when they tasted it, there was a moment of laughter, an easy, genuine laugh that surprised both of them. Evenings began to change, too. Instead of silence, there was now the soft murmur of conversation near the fireplace. Nita would curl up with a blanket half asleep, while Ayanna asked careful questions about life on the ranch. Ethan, in turn, asked nothing about where they had come from, letting them choose their own pace. It was in these small, unspoken exchanges that something new began to grow, a fragile, mutual respect. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Ethan leaned against the fence, watching Nita chase a chicken across the yard, laughing so hard she could barely stand. The sound carried on the breeze, light and free. It had been a long time since laughter like that had touched this land. Ayanna stood a short distance away, her arms crossed, but there was a softness in her eyes as she watched her sister. "She hasn't laughed like that in months," she said quietly, almost to herself. Ethan glanced at her. "She just needed a place to feel safe," he replied. "That's all anyone needs." Ayanna looked at him for a moment longer, as if weighing something, but said nothing more. Still, in that moment, something shifted between them, a quiet acknowledgement that this place, for all its loneliness, was becoming something else, a shelter, a chance. Trust came slowly, like water wearing down a stone, but every day it grew. The sisters no longer flinched at every sudden noise, no longer kept their eyes down when he spoke to them. And Ethan, who had spent so many years behind the walls he had built, began to feel the cracks in those walls widen, letting in small pieces of light. By the end of that week, it was no longer strange to see them there. It felt, in a way he hadn't expected, almost natural. The ranch, once silent, now carried voices again, and though nothing had been said aloud about how long they might stay, a quiet understanding seemed to settle among the three of them. For now, they belonged here. That night, as the fire burned low and the sky outside was filled with stars, Ethan sat in his chair, listening to the even breathing of the two sisters as they slept nearby. He realized then that, without even knowing it, the house no longer felt empty, and for the first time in years, that thought didn't scare him. The night was calm, unusually calm, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Outside, the world lay bathed in silver from a full moon, the field stretching silent and still under its pale glow. Inside the cabin, the fire in the hearth had burned low, its flames licking gently at the logs, casting a soft golden light over the walls. Ethan sat in his chair, boots propped on the edge of the hearth, his eyes half closed from the long day. Nita was asleep already, curled under a blanket on the rug, her chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. Ayanna sat nearby, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of warm tea, staring at the fire as if she could find her future in its shifting embers. They had been like this many evenings before, quiet, with only the occasional word spoken, but tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that comes when someone has carried a secret for far too long and finally decides it can't be held any longer. Ethan noticed the tension in Ayanna's posture, the way she kept opening her mouth as though to speak, and then closing it again. "You've been wanting to say something all night," he said gently, breaking the stillness. "Go ahead." For a moment she didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the flames. Then, slowly, she lowered her gaze to her hands. "You've been kind to us," she said softly, "and you've asked for nothing in return. You deserve to know why we came here." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, waiting. Ayanna drew in a long breath, steadying herself. "Our parents are gone," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were killed. It happened so suddenly. One day we had a home, and the next, her voice cracked, and she had to pause. We were alone. The room was silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. "It wasn't an accident," she continued after a moment, her voice sharper now, edged with something fierce. "It was family. My uncle, my mother's brother. He wanted everything. The land, the money, whatever little we had. When my father refused to give it up, he made sure there was nothing left of him, of both of them." She stopped, staring hard at the floor, her hands clenched so tightly around the mug that her knuckles went white. "He told me we would belong to him now," she said finally, her words low and bitter. "He said he would decide what happened to us. I couldn't let that happen. So I ran. We ran. We've been running ever since, hoping we could find somewhere far enough away that he wouldn't find us. Somewhere safe." Ethan didn't speak right away. He could feel the weight behind every word she had spoken, could see in her eyes that she had been holding this in for far too long. "You did the right thing," he said at last. Ayanna looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face. "Even if it means bringing trouble to your door?" "Trouble's part of life," he said simply. "No one deserves to live in fear, least of all her," he added, glancing at the sleeping Nita. The faintest hint of relief softened her features. For a moment, there was quiet again. Then Ethan shifted in his chair, leaning back with a thoughtful look. "You should know something, too," he said. "You're not the only one here who's lost family." Ayanna's eyes widened slightly, curiosity replacing some of the tension. He stared into the fire as he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Years ago, before I came out here for good, I had a wife and a boy, the kind of life I thought would last forever." His hand tightened on the armrest of the chair. "Then one winter, sickness came through the town, took half the people with it, including them. By the time spring came, there wasn't anything left worth staying for. So I left. I came here. Figured if I kept to myself, the world couldn't hurt me again." The fire popped softly, a small ember leaping up before falling back into the coals. "For a long time, that's all I did," he said. "I lived alone. I worked, and I made sure I didn't have to care about anyone else. It was simple that way. Easier. Until that night you knocked on my door." Ayanna's throat tightened as she listened. "And now?" she asked. "And now," he said with a faint, wry smile, "I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong. Maybe keeping people out doesn't stop the hurt. It just makes the hurt quieter." She looked down at her sister, fast asleep under the blanket, and then back at him. "You could have turned us away," she said. "I could have," he admitted, "but I didn't, and I won't." The words hung in the warm air between them, heavier than a promise. For the first time since that terrible day she fled her home, Ayanna felt the faintest stirrings of something she thought she had lost forever: safety. The fire burned low and silence settled again, but was no longer the heavy, tense silence of before. It was a different kind, one made of understanding. Ayanna set her empty mug aside and pulled the blanket tighter around her sister. Her own eyes grew heavy, and she let herself lean back against the chair, the exhaustion of the past few months finally beginning to lift. Ethan stayed awake a little longer, staring into the fire, thinking of the girl's story and of the path that had brought her here. Outside, the moon moved slowly across the sky, and inside, for the first time, there were no more secrets between them. The wind carried an uneasy stillness that morning. Even the usual sound of the ranch, the cattle lowing, the soft cluck of chickens, seemed quieter than normal, as the earth itself knew something was about to happen. Ethan stood on the porch, a hand resting on the wooden post, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. For days, there had been no sign of trouble, but he had learned to trust his instincts. And today, those instincts were on edge. Inside, Ayanna and Nita were finishing breakfast. The sisters had settled into their new life, but in their movements there still lingered a cautious awareness, the kind that came from always waiting for danger to catch up. They didn't know if their uncle or anyone else from that past would ever find them, but neither of them truly believed they had left it all behind. Around midday, as the sun climbed high and the light spread over the open land, a faint dust cloud appeared on the distant road. Ethan spotted it first, a thin line that rose against the bright sky. His heart sank. This far out, no one came by without a reason. He turned back into the cabin, his voice calm but urgent. Stay inside, he told them. Close the shutters. Ayanna froze, reading the look in his eyes. Is it them? I don't know, he admitted. But I'm not taking chances. By the time the riders came into view, the sisters were peeking through a narrow crack in the shutter. 3 men on horseback, riding fast and hard, dust billowing behind them. Even at a distance, the way they carried themselves spoke of danger. Ethan stepped out to meet them before they could reach the house, his hand resting casually on the rifle leaning against the porch post. He stood tall, unmoving, the sun beating down on his hat as the horses slowed to a stop a few yards away. The man in front, tall and broad with a hard face, looked down at him. We're looking for 2 girls, he said, his tone sharp. Native girls. They've been running. You seen anyone pass through here? Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Lots of travelers come through after a storm. He replied evenly. What's your business with them? That's not your concern, the man snapped. We just need to know if you've seen them. From inside, Ayanna's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. She knew that voice. Even after all these weeks, she would never forget it. It was her uncle. Ethan let a slow breath out, shifting slightly. This is private land, he said. If you got trouble, you'd best take it somewhere else. The man's eyes narrowed. So you've seen them? The tension was like a drawn bowstring. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man dismounted, walking a few steps closer, his boots crunching on the dry dirt. You don't want to get in the middle of this, he warned. They belong with me. Ethan's jaw tightened. No, he said, they don't. Inside the cabin, Nita clutched Ayanna's hand. Ayanna could feel the tremble in her sister's small fingers, but she forced herself to be still, to watch, to wait. I'll give you one chance, the man said, his voice low and dangerous. Bring them out now, or we'll take them ourselves. Ethan stepped forward, his hand brushing the rifle. You're not taking them anywhere. What happened next was fast and chaotic. The man lunged forward, and Ethan raised the rifle, not firing, but holding it ready. One of the other men started to reach for a weapon, but before he could draw, the cabin door burst open. Ayanna stood in the doorway, her chin high, her voice cutting through the standoff. We're not going with you, she said. Her uncle turned, his face twisting with fury. You don't get to decide that, girl. Yes, I do, she said, her voice shaking but loud. We're not yours to take. We never were. Nita stepped out beside her sister, holding a heavy stick from the firewood pile like a weapon. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something fierce in them, too. The sight of them there, standing side by side, gave Ethan a surge of determination. You heard them, he said, his voice like steel. They stay here. Now leave. The uncle's face flushed red, his hand twitching near his belt. But he must have seen something in Ethan's stance, something that promised a fight wouldn't end in his favor, because after a long, tense moment, he spat into the dirt and turned away. This isn't over, he snarled as he swung back onto his horse. You think you can hide them? You'll regret this. Get off my land, Ethan said. The 3 men rode away, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. Only when they were small on the horizon did Ethan lower the rifle and let out the breath he'd been holding. Inside the cabin, the tension hung thick. Ayanna shut the door, leaning against it for support, while Nita set down the stick, her small hands trembling. Ethan turned to them, his voice calm but firm. You're safe here, he said. As long as I'm breathing, no one's taking you anywhere. For the first time, Ayanna believed him. That night, as the stars came out, the sisters sat near the fire, their bodies still tense from the encounter. But beneath the fear was something new, a sense of belonging. They were no longer running alone. They had someone willing to stand with them. And that, more than anything, changed everything. The next morning dawned clear, but the air felt thick with everything that had happened the day before. The ranch, usually peaceful, seemed different now, as if it knew danger had brushed too close to its doors. Ethan was already awake, leaning against the porch post, watching the line of trees that framed the horizon. He knew men like Ayanna's uncle rarely gave up after one confrontation. Inside, Ayanna and Nita moved quietly, their steps lighter, but their eyes constantly drifting toward the windows. It was the first time in weeks they slept knowing someone else was willing to stand up for them. Still, the shadow of fear clung to them. By midday, dust rose again on the road, and Ethan knew the trouble wasn't over. He didn't even bother reaching for his rifle this time. He was ready. When the riders came into view, there were more of them now, 5, maybe 6 men, but behind them came something unexpected. 2 riders wearing the long coats and badges of the county authorities. Word of the previous day's standoff had clearly traveled faster than Ethan expected. The group came to a stop in front of the ranch, tension rolling off him like heat from the sun. One of the deputies spoke first, his voice carrying a note of command. "We've heard there's been trouble," he said. "We're here to get to the bottom of it." Ayana's uncle dismounted immediately, throwing a glare toward Ethan. "Those girls belong to me," he shouted. "He's keeping them against their will." Before the deputy could respond, Ayana came forward, Nita close behind. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "We are not with him by choice," she said loudly. "We ran away because he killed our parents. He wanted to control us, not protect us." Gasps rippled through the few neighbors who had gathered at a distance to watch. It was the first time she had spoken of it in public. The deputy turned to the uncle, his brow furrowed. "You hear that? Those are serious accusations." "She's lying," the uncle barked. "They're just kids. They don't know what they're saying." "Then why are they standing here?" Ethan said, his tone calm but firm, telling everyone the same thing. "You came out here with a gang of men to drag them back, and you think that makes you the one telling the truth." For a long moment, the standoff held, but the deputies weren't fools. They had seen enough of men like this to know the truth when it was laid bare. "You and your men need to turn around," the deputy finally said. "If these girls say they want nothing to do with you, then that's the law. You got no claim here." The uncle sputtered, rage twisting his face, but he could see there was no winning this. With a final furious glance at Ethan, he spat on the ground and swung onto his horse. "This isn't finished," he growled. "Yeah," Ethan replied. "It is. You step foot on this land again, you'll answer to me and the law." The riders turned and left, the cloud of dust behind them slowly settling over the prairie. When the sound of hooves faded, the deputies nodded to Ethan. "You did the right thing," one of them said. "Keep them safe. We'll make sure word gets out in town about what really happened." As they rode away, the tension that had gripped the ranch for days began to loosen, like a rope cut free. For the first time since they arrived, Ayana and Nita felt the full weight of fear lift from their shoulders. The danger was gone. Not entirely, but enough for them to breathe again. Over the next few days, something changed in the way the community looked at Ethan. When he rode into town for supplies, the whispers were different. People who had once only gossiped now tipped their hats, offering a quiet respect. They had seen what he had done. A man who had lived alone for years, opening his home and risking his safety for 2 girls who had no one else. Back on the ranch, life returned to its steady rhythm, but it was no longer just his. The sisters worked beside him, as though they had always belonged there. Nita laughed again, full and free, while Ayana grew more confident every day. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, Ethan called him to the porch. He stood there for a moment, looking at the wide land that stretched out around them, then at the 2 faces that had come to mean more to him than he had ever expected. "You need to hear this from me," he said. "This place, it's not just mine anymore. It's ours. You're not guests here. You're part of this ranch. You're part of my life now." Ayana's throat tightened. Her voice caught somewhere between relief and gratitude. "You don't have to do that," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but I want to." The quiet that followed was filled with something bigger than words. From that day on, the ranch was no longer a place of silence. It was a home. For the sisters, it was the first true home they'd had since everything was taken from them. And for Ethan, it was the first time in years that he felt he wasn't alone. The prairie wind blew soft across the land, carried with the scent of grass and the sound of laughter that once again belonged to this place. The days that followed were unlike anything the ranch had seen in years. Where once there had been only the sound of wind across the open plains, now there was a hum of voices, the soft patter of footsteps, and bursts of laughter that drifted across the yard like music. The change was so gradual that Ethan hadn't noticed it at first. But one morning, as he stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, he realized that the silence that had haunted his life for so long was gone. Life began to settle into a new rhythm. Every day started early, as it always had. But there was something different about the way the ranch woke up now. Nita's voice carried through the house before the sun even rose, urging the sleepy chickens out of their coop. Ayanna prepared breakfast with a steady, practiced hand, moving around the small kitchen with quiet confidence. And Ethan, who had grown so used to doing everything alone, found himself looking forward to the bustle that greeted him every morning. Meals no longer felt like chores. They had become a time to sit together, to talk about the work that lay ahead, and to share small moments that were quickly becoming precious. There was teasing now, soft and good-natured. There was conversation where once there had been silence. More than once, Ethan caught himself smiling, without even realizing it as he listened to the sisters laugh. The work on the ranch didn't grow easier, but it felt lighter. Ayanna had taken to repairing fences with him, her hands skilled now, no longer uncertain. Nita, despite her size, insisted on helping with the animals, her fearless spirit bringing even the most stubborn horses to heel. They became part of the land just as much as the cattle, the fences, and the wide sky overhead. In the evenings, after chores were done, the three of them often sat on the porch together. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. The simple presence of someone else nearby was enough. For a man who had spent years keeping the world at arm's length, the company was a gift he never expected. As the weeks passed, the people in town began to see the change too. When Ethan rode in for supplies, he was no longer alone. Ayanna walked beside him, and Nita ran ahead, smiling at the shopkeepers who now greeted them without judgment. The whispers that once followed them had turned to nods of respect. Where suspicion had been, there was now acceptance. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills and painted the sky in streaks of orange and pink, Ethan called the sisters out to the porch. The field stretched endlessly before them, bathed in warm light. For a long moment, he just looked out at the land, then back at them, as though weighing his words carefully. "This ranch," he said at last, his voice steady, "used to be nothing but work and quiet. I thought that was enough. But it's different now. You've changed this place." Ayanna lowered her gaze, unsure of how to respond. Nita tilted her head, curious. Ethan smiled faintly and continued, "You don't ever need to wonder if you have to leave. This is your home now. Always. No matter what comes." Ayanna's breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She swallowed hard and managed to quiet, "Thank you," but the words felt too small for what she wanted to say. Nita, more fearless than her sister, ran forward and threw her arms around him, hugging him tight. For a second, Ethan froze. Hugs had not been a part of his life for a long time, but then he knelt down, returning the embrace, holding on to her as if she had always been his. The last light of day spilled across the yard, and something shifted in that moment. The ranch, which had been a lonely outpost on the edge of the world, had become a home. Not just a place to live, but a place to belong. The weeks turned into months. Seasons began to change. By the time autumn arrived, the ranch was full of life in ways that Ethan had never thought possible. The sound of laughter echoed from the barn. The smell of bread drifted out from the kitchen window. And in every corner of the land, there was the unmistakable mark of people who cared for each other. One night, as the stars glittered above and a fire crackled softly in the hearth, Ethan sat in his old chair, looking around the cabin. Nita was asleep, curled in a blanket near the fire. Ayanna sat by the table, mending a shirt with steady hands, her face calm, her shoulders no longer carrying the weight of fear. He thought of the man he had been before they arrived, a man who believed his life would end in solitude. Then he looked at them, the family he had never expected, and realized how wrong he had been. The lonely cowboy had found something greater than peace. He had found purpose. He had found love, not in the way of grand declarations, but in the quiet, steady way that fills the empty places of heart and makes them whole again. As the fire burned low, he whispered softly to himself, "Home," and for the first time in years, The word felt true.